Alright, so interpolation. So here's my same sad little cubes from the last video, and you can see that I only have 3 keyframes on these, one at the beginning and the end of the loop, and then one in the center. And then Maya is just sort of deciding how these are going to move between those keyframes. And that sort of automated movement is called interpolation. And there's a few different ways that you can sort of view this and change this in case it's not giving you the motion that you want. So, I'm going to open what is called the graph editor. So if you go into Windows, Animation Editors, and Graph Editor, it's going to pull up this little beast of a thing. I should also tell you that you can get these to do what you want by just aggressively keying every frame, and it's an awful way to do things. Before I learned how to use the graph editor, that's what I did, and it was awful. The graph editor, it might take you like a little bit longer to get started with it just to figure out like how it works. So much easier, I think. Anyway, definitely more organized. Alright, so basically, so many emails. Basically what the graph editor is a visual representation of the movement of these objects. So it's going to show you for whatever objects you have selected. In this case it's only one. You can select multiples at once and I'll show you all of them. It's going to show you, again, all of the different translate, rotate, scale values laid out visually. If you click on any one of these in particular, it will show you those values in graphical form. So you can kind of see, like, if I go to frame 1, it's going to show you the little sort of orange diamond is like saying, hey, there's a keyframe on that value here. And then as your object moves down, it goes to the next keyframe. And then these values in between are how much it's changing position over a given amount of time. So the way to look at this is kind of imagine like a speed graph you're doing, like one of those stupid word problems or whatever that they always give you in algebra class. But basically faster movement is going to have a steeper slope. So it's basically there's more change happening in a short amount of time compared to something like this up here where there's very, very little change happening over kind of a longer period of time. So again, basically it's a graphical way to view the movement of your object. If you added, rotation or anything like that on here, that would show up as well. So there's a few different ways that you can change how this behaves. You can, if you click on an existing keyframe, or you can sort of left click and drag to marquee select multiples. I'll just grab one for now. It's going to bring up this little gimbal. So for one, you can actually change the positioning of this keyframe, so I'm free to drag this around anywhere I want. And you can see that as I do that, it is actually changing the position of my object, and it's also going to change how it moves. So if I go ahead and play this animation, you can see that this one that I've modified the graph on is clearly doing something very, very different from this one. And that's just because I've basically changed the keyframe position and value. So that's one thing that you can do. I'm going to undo all of that. You can also grab these little gimbals on the side, and if you've ever worked with something like Illustrator or Photoshop where you're using Bezier curves, pretty much the same deal, honestly. This is just a Bezier curve. But you can do some pretty weird stuff with that, and again, change how these objects are going to move between the keyframes. So if I play this, its object is going to shoot, oh my, back and forth very aggressively across my screen because I've done something very, very weird with the keyframes. I'm going to undo that aggressively. So now we should be back at our original animation. If you ever need to... I need to stop full screening this, it's quite silly. But if you ever need to modify, say, one of these, like you don't want to change the left part of this curve as you're moving the right little handle here, there's a way you can do that. So you just grab your keyframe, right-click, and do break tangents. That's going to make these lines dashed, and you can see that now you are free to move them individually. When you do this, it does tend to make a pretty harsh little angle here, but it does allow you an extra level of control if you need that. Just to say maybe I'm happy with this, and then it turns out that I actually want these to be connected together again. Again, just select your keyframe, right-click, and do unify tangents. And now when I move one of these, it's going to take both of them with it, and it's maintained whatever weird angle I've put in there with the break tangents. I'm gonna undo that, because I don't like it. And that's more or less like the super basic way of like manually manipulating interpolation. There's a few other things that you can do with this. So these are all basically different formulas for Maya calculating interpolation. So by default, it does sort of like a bell curve where it's like slow and then it speeds up a little bit and then it slows at the end. The other one that I use most frequently is this linear tangent button, and that's going to say instead of like slowly ramping up your speed and then slowing down again, just go in the same. Ooh, what have I done? Ooh, there we go. Unify my tangents again. I'm going to go from point A to point B at a uniform speed. So you can do this for individual keyframes. You'll notice that as I only selected the one on the end and hit linear, it's only modified that tangent. Again, I'm going to do this, only select the one on the end and do linear for this as well. And you can see that this has made this sort of a much different curve from the original. So if we look at the motion of these, you can see that the one closer to the camera is the modified one, and it sort of hits the end over here much harder, and it doesn't slow down as much as this one does. So you can do that, again, with the whole animation. I should select my cube. So I'm just going to grab this keyframe, and again, just do linear tangents for that. And you can see, again, that now it's not really speeding up or slowing down as compared to this original guy. And you can, again, just sort of like visual way to see the changes of motion between these two objects. So you can play around, again, usually I will either just use the default Maya interpolation or linear tangents, but there's a bunch of other ones that you can also play around with. Just sort of figure out, you know, what you need if one thing is going to get you a little bit closer to what you want from the other one. The other thing that I want to go over really quick is you can actually delete, so I should do moving things. If you need to, you can actually delete keyframes here, so I'm just going to marquee select sort of all of these extra values which are keyed and not doing anything, and literally just press delete. That's all I'm going to do. So you can do that also for like the end of your animation, but I usually like to go through and sort of get rid of unnecessary keyframes, or one other thing I do a lot is if I have a keyframe, I just sort of set a random key on frame 28. And you can see that it's not, like this keyframe isn't really changing the shape of the curve much, if at all. So a lot of times I'll go through, yes, a little bit, but a lot of times I'll go through and sort of delete stuff like this and just sort of tweak the tangent, so it's one less keyframe that I have to contend with while I'm animating. I like, personally, as few keyframes as possible, just because it makes things easier to edit. You don't need to go back and sort of counter key against other keyframes. It's just, to me, a little bit nicer. The other thing that I want to go over really quick, let me just make this linear for grins, is creating sort of perpetual looping animations within a larger animation. So if I add 120 frames to this, I'm just going to add a random sphere in here and just sort of, I don't know, just make this move somewhere random, and I guess actually I'll make this loop, so pardon me for 5 seconds while I just go through and do something super weird. Who knows what I'm actually doing. Alright. So this is a very sad, awkward little animation, and say that I want these little cubes moving back and forth throughout this animation. One option is to manually key this for the duration of your animation, and that's awful, because if you decide you change your loop, then it's gonna make you change like a billion copies of that same animation. The other option is to go, I'm gonna just grab both of these objects, and I am going to, there's like options literally to just make them loop forever. So if you look up here, there's these sort of, I don't really know how to describe these icons, little squiggly lines that are white and orange. And these are going to automatically loop your animation for you. So usually they hover over with the actual tool name, but for some reason not doing that. So this one is going to basically repeat your animations for frames before the keyframes you set. And this one is going to repeat them forever after the keyframes you set. So you can see it sort of like grays out the animation. It's not really showing you the keyframes. But what's really powerful is that I'm able to come through, and as I modify the keyframes of the original, it changes all of them at once. Which is, again, really, really nice for doing additional sort of looping animations without manually having to key everything. So now if I go through and I play this, you should see that these cubes are just going to bounce back and forth forever, while this keeps doing whatever the heck it's doing. So that's a really, really handy feature I actually didn't know about until a while ago, and it's kind of my new favorite thing whenever I need it. So hopefully that makes sense. That is the graph editor in a nutshell for like the most common things that I use it for. And I would highly recommend familiarizing yourself with it, because it is a really, really nice way to be able to go through and sort of help smooth your animations out. In the next video, I don't know what I'm talking about, I need to look at my notes. I'll see you guys soon.